friends of the library and the staff for the refreshments. Thank you to Haley Booksellers. Dick has books available for purchase, and you'll have an opportunity to have our author sign them after his talk. Tonight, we are so happy to have Christopher Castellani here with us to talk about his new book. Leading Men is an expansive yet intimate story of desire, artistic ambition, and fidelity, set in the glamorous literary and film circles of 1950s Italy. In July 1953, at a glittering party thrown by Truman Capote in Portofino, Italy, Tennessee Williams and his longtime lover, Frank Merlo, meet Anya Blomgren, a mysteriously taciturn young Swedish beauty and aspiring actress. Their encounter will go on to alter all of their lives. Chris is the son of Italian immigrants and a native of Wilmington, Delaware. He currently lives in Boston, where he is the artistic director of Grub Street, the country's largest and leading independent creative writing center. I think we have some Grub Street people here. He's the author of 4 critically acclaimed novels, A Kiss from Madalena, The Saint of Lost Things, All This Talk of Love, and Leading Men, for which he received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the McDowell Colony, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. In addition to his work with Grub Street, Christopher is on the faculty and academic board of the Warren Wilson MFA program and Breadloaf Writers Conference. Chris was educated at Swarthmore College, received his master's in English literature from Tufts University, and a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing from Boston University. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Castellani.
Thank you very much, Diana, for that, and thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. I heard that you have a strong contingent of people who come out for these events. That's really, really wonderful to have this community here. You already know a little bit about the book from what Diane said, but I'm going to not only tell you a bit more about the book, but I'm going to show you a bit more about the book. I'm not the type of writer that does slideshows usually. It feels sort of strange to me, like I'm selling pharmaceuticals or something. but I have no pharmaceuticals to sell. But the characters in this book and the settings of the book were so compelling to me as I was writing them, and so vivid to me that I thought it was almost a crime not to show you some of the real people who are in this novel and the real places where they were. Because as you already know, this novel, though it is a novel, does include some characters who are real and some who are invented. And I also created this slideshow because the first question I always get, usually it's my phone that goes off when I'm reading, so the first question I always get when I've been reading from this book is how much is true and how much did you make up? Where did this come from? Where did that come from? So I'm going to head off that question at the pass by doing this presentation. Okay, so the way of the night will go, just so you know, I'm going to do this presentation for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to read for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions if you have them, and I'm happy to sign books. I feel like it's good to know that I'm not going to read for like an hour, so just so you can settle in. Okay, so see if this works. Excellent. Yes. So this part is true. In July of 1953, Truman Capote he was on there on the left, invited his frenemy. July of 1953, Truman Capote invited his frenemy Tennessee Williams to visit him, invited his frenemy Tennessee Williams and Williams' partner Frank Merlo to visit him in Portofino. Tennessee and Frank were 4 years into their long relationship, living in Rome for the summer and having a rough summer. Frank was restless and aimless and had taken a lover. Tennessee was struggling to write his next great play after A Streetcar Named Desire. That same month of Capote's invitation, and I should mention that if any of you've read the book, that's actually a shot from his actual porch above the Delfino restaurant, where they all gather for that party, and from that very same summer. So I was very happy to find the actual shot of him there. Anyway, so that same month that Capote invited them to Portofino, Williams wrote in his journal, "Frank's behavior toward me has become insufferable. He is sunk into such a pit of habit and inertia and basic contempt for his position in life, which I think he hates me for. Oscar Wilde uttered a true thing when he said, 'Each man kills the thing he loves. The killing is not voluntary, but we sure in hell do it, and burn for it. I have given up faith in happy solutions to problems between two people, but I shall try to think of something just the same.'" So when I read that journal entry, first of all, who writes in their journal like that? But you just see like the sensibility of Williams. So when I read this in Williams' journal, he kept constant journals and notebooks. He didn't have a photo of himself in his own notebook, but I spliced those two together. But this is it's a sample from his notebook. He kept constant journals and notebooks, but he made no entries at all soon after that invitation that Capote extended to him for a couple weeks. There was a sort of empty space, not torn out pages, but just no entries between July 28th and August 7th of 1953. And I thought, here's the part I made up. What if they got into Tennessee's Jaguar and they drove up the coast to Portofino to go to Truman's party? What and who might they find there? So this is true too. That same month, July of '53, a few hours away from Portofino in Rome in Florence, expat author John Horne Burns, Andover native, was drinking himself to death. If you've never heard of John Horne Burns, how many of you have heard of Burns before? Yeah, you've heard. If you've never heard of John Horne Burns, you're not alone. When he published his first novel, The Gallery, in 1949, he was heralded as one of the first great post-war American novelists. But then his next two novels completely flopped, and he was so humiliated and furious that he abandoned the U.S. altogether. Miserable but finally free, he took up with a handsome Italian doctor, as one does, in Florence, and a doctor named Sandro. All that is true. But I wondered, what if they too had received and accepted an invitation to Truman's party? But whether or not they did, the fact is that Burns died 2 weeks after the party, on August 11th, 1953, just a few hours away in Livorno, quite mysteriously. And speculation remains that Sandro, his handsome Italian doctor, had a hand in his death. So here's another true thing. Another letter from that same month, July '53, this time from Truman Capote to David O. Selznick. So Capote writes, "There are some simply extraordinary people in Portofino. There is an Australian girl who ran away with her stepfather, and a Swedish mother and daughter, who share a fisherman between them. But these are very ordinary instances. Altogether, this place is fraught with peril." And I wondered what sort of peril could occur in this beautiful playground of the rich and famous, and what if that Swedish mother and daughter were somehow involved in it? Actually, what if that daughter was a young, aspiring actress named Anya, and Tennessee and Frank discover her, and she goes on to become one of the most celebrated actresses of her time, the muse of a great director, someone like, say, Liv Ullmann or Ingrid Bergman? And what if late in life, after she had outlived all the men who'd shaped her career, Anya became a director herself? And what if, for nearly 4 decades, she'd held on to a play that Tennessee wrote just for her in the months before he died? So Frank and Anya's friendship is forged that weekend in Portofino after some of that peril that Capote wrote about. They are the two narrators of this novel. That's actually Greta Garbo. But it's about the age that I imagine Anya to be, or how I imagine her to look. And she's Swedish and an actress, so it was close enough. And so these are the two narrators in alternating chapters of the novel. Frank is narrating from Manhattan in 1963. He's 40 years old, and he's dying of lung cancer, waiting for Tennessee to visit him one last time. And that's actually how I was introduced to Frank. I was reading in a memoir that a memoir written by a friend of Williams that about the scene. I was reading the scene where Frank was dying in the hospital in Manhattan, and everyone was coming to visit him. Vivian Leigh and Irene Selznick and Audrey Wood, who was Williams's agent. All these people were coming to sort of say goodbye to him, but Williams would not come. And they were estranged a bit, but they were still in each other's lives. And that was very poignant to me. And so I structured the novel around him waiting for Williams to visit him. Anya's narrating from the present day. She's in her late 70s and reclusive and living in a U.S. city that she despises so ferociously that she can't even bear to name it. But it's Boston. That's what it is. I was able to channel all of my frustrations with Boston into her character. So now is when I'm get completely obnoxious and I name drop and tell you that a few years ago I was at a party with Liv Ullmann, and it was she who sparked the idea for Anya's character. But everything else about, and she could not be more gorgeous. She who sparked the idea for Anya's character, but everything else about her is invented. And when I told her that I was drafting a novel about Williams, or with Williams as a character, I should say, she told me about her one encounter that she had with him back in the 70s, and it's not in the book. So I'm just going to tell you here as like a DVD extra kind of. She said she was in a hotel lobby in Paris in sometime in the 70s or late 60s, I forget exactly. And she was a fan of Williams, she was a huge admirer of him, and she recognized that he was in the same lobby all the way across the lobby. And she saw that he had his dog with him. He always had bulldogs, and bulldogs appear in the book quite a bit. She saw him across the room, wanted to go up to him, but she was too shy. So she saw that the bulldog kind of wandered away from Williams. He was talking and the bulldog was on her leash, the bulldog wandered away. So she got the idea to hastily like scrawl like a mash note to him, and she took the note, she went over to the dog and she tucked the note under his collar, and then stood back and watched as the dog ambled its way back to Williams and reunited with Williams. And she watched Williams like notice the paper, pick it up, read it, and figure out what was going on, look up, find her across the lobby, and was marching over to her, and she's all excited and nervous and thrilled. And he went up to her, and he thrust out the paper, and he said, "My dog is not your mailman." And then he walked away, and that was it. And she was cured. Yes, exactly. No more fans. No more fans. But she actually did go on. Liv Ullmann did go on to direct a very successful production of Streetcar in New York in the early 2000s. I keep forgetting to look up the exact date. But she remained a fan of his work, but wasn't thrilled with that one encounter. So off and on for the past 20 years, actually that's when I first read that biography of Williams, I've held these people close to me, the real people and the invented people. There are other real people in the book. Anna Magnani, the great Italian actress, larger than life. There's a fabulous documentary coming out about her soon, if it's not out already. Paul Bowles makes an appearance, and also Luchino Visconti, who's the great Italian director, is making a movie during this time that Williams is writing the script for. So sometimes I forget who I made up and whose books and journals and letters and biographies I've read and reread as research for the book. I interviewed a man who calls himself the last living lover of Tennessee Williams. He had a lot of juicy information that I wove into the story. I visited Portofino, of course, and Rome, and Livorno. That was very rough to see the places where they lived and died. And as I crafted the story, a story between the cracks of what was known about these people, I aspired to create characters like the Virginia Woolf of Michael Cunningham's The Hours, the Henry James of Colm Tóibín's The Master, and Bin, the Vietnamese cook of Alice B. Toklas, and Gertrude Stein in Monique Trong's The Book of Salt. Those are the three books that were my model: The Book of Salt, The Hours, and The Master. Novels both lyrical and literary, but which also tell a story whose endings you both long for and can't bear. I was particularly inspired by the way that Colm Tóibín in The Master made each chapter of that book, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Each chapter of that book is like a take on a Henry James story. It's not like a where did Henry James get the idea for that story. It's just kind of like a funhouse mirror version of that story. So you're reading and you're like, wait, this is like The Turn of the Screw, or wait, this is like Portrait of a Lady. Each chapter is kind of a little take on it. And so that gave me the idea to make actually all of Leading Men is kind of like a funhouse mirror version of the Williams play Suddenly Last Summer. And if it's my favorite of his major plays, not because it's his best play, but because it's sort of his weirdest and his most troubling, and in a way his most perverse. And so I have to show you it's totally self-indulgent, but I'm going to show you the trailer of the Elizabeth Taylor version of this, and this will inform the reading as well. Come on, Mark. Oh, we were doing so well. It worked earlier. Why does this happen? Yeah, we're done with you. There we go. This will give you a sense of the tone of the book.
Sebastian only needed you while you were still useful.
Useful?
I mean young, able to attract.
She's babbling again, babbling and lying.
He left her home because
you stole him.
Lost her attractiveness.
What does attractiveness have to do with the son of the mother?
You see, Doctor, we were both decoys.
It's only slightly melodramatic.
This generation's greatest author and poet, writer of A Streetcar Named Desire and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, unashamedly writes of a woman's strong wants and a man's strange needs.
If you've read the book, you'll recognize this.
6 great stars combine their talents to recreate Suddenly Last Summer, Tennessee Williams' magnificent drama.
Something horrible happened to that girl last summer. Some dreadful, traumatic experience of some kind.
What?
It was a one-piece bathing suit made of something white. The water made it transparent. I told him I didn't want to swim in it, but he just grabbed me by the hand and dragged me into the water. All the way in. I came out looking nude.
Why did he do that? Do you know why he did that?
Yes. You know why I was doing it. I told you.
So this will play out. But so I told that anecdote about Williams in the lobby, and I show this trailer to illustrate in part the sort of mercurial nature of Williams, the melodramatic nature of Williams, and to say that it's living with him in the shadow of his genius as his partner and his great love that first and most strongly inspired me to write this novel. Because the person at the heart of this book isn't Anya or Tennessee Williams or John Horn Burns or Truman Capote. It's Frank Merlo, a working class Italian American guy like me, a truck driver, a Jersey boy, a veteran, an aspiring dancer, an actor, a dreamer, a romantic, the life of the party. He died too young, heartbroken, in pain, his chest burned black from cobalt treatments, and I wanted to bring him back to life and to give him some joy. The truth is that Williams was at the pinnacle of his career during the years that he was with Frank, the ones just after Streetcar, the years of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and Night of the Iguana, and Suddenly Last Summer, and Sweet Bird of Youth, and The Rose Tattoo, which is the play that Williams dedicated to Frank. And some of you may have seen that they're doing a revival of The Rose Tattoo on Broadway this fall with Marissa Tomei. And even if you don't read this book, I want you to know that after Frank died in 1963, Williams went into a depression from which he never recovered, and that he wrote every single day for 20 more years, but he never had another hit. What was the alchemy between these two men? What was it like for Frank to live in that double closet, the traditional closet and the closet of anonymity? And why, if you believe Williams's memoirs, did Frank never once in their 15 years together tell him that he loved him, when he clearly did? So I'm going to read a little bit from the book, but before I do, I wanted to just bring in 2 minutes of Tennessee Williams. I couldn't access any film or audio of Frank, but since I've spent so much time with Williams mining his and Frank's lives, I wanted him to speak about Frank in his own words. And he wrote a poem. He wrote only a couple poems about Frank, but the most famous one is called The Little Horse, which is the nickname that Williams had for Frank. And it references the night they met in Provincetown, which is where they met on the steps of the A House, the Atlantic House bar in Provincetown. And it was a rainy night, and they had one night together, and then they didn't see each other for a year until they walked by each other on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. And so this poem captures a little bit of their dynamic, and hopefully you can hear it.
For Frank Merlo.
But the words are there if you need them.
Mignon he was, or mignonnette, avec les yeux le grand gris. My name for him was Little Horse. I fear he had no name for me. I came upon him more by plan than accident appeared to be. Something started off, or something stopped, and there I was, and there was he. And then it rained, but Little Horse had brought along his parapluie. Petit Cheval it kept quite dry till he divided with me, for it was late, and I was lost. When Little Horse inquired of me, what has a bark but cannot bite, and I was right. It was a tree. Mignon he is, or mignonnette, avec les yeux très grands louis. My name for him is Little Horse. I wish he had a name for me.
So you get a little bit of the sense of like the way he thought of him as like this, like almost childlike guy, which he was in a way, and how he was always the one who was prepared. He had the umbrella, and they had this playful relationship. If you don't speak French, mignon is cute, right? And mignonnette is the sort of feminized version of cute, with eyes bigger than he is, so. No. No.
But Frank Merlo.
No. We're done with that. Okay, let's put that. I'll just leave it like that. So I'm going to read a little bit from. I figured since it was a nice warm day, although it wasn't sunny, I would read a section from when they're on the beach in Portofino. And as you know, the narrator is Frank, the longtime partner of Williams. It's 1953. So the night before this scene was the night of the party with Truman Capote, at Truman Capote's, I should say, where they met the Swedish mother and daughter, Anya, and Bitta is her mother's name. They were dressed in identical white dresses, trying to kind of look alike, like they were sisters. The rest, and then you should know, yeah, you know already, that Frank is narrating from his bed in the hospital, 10 years after the scene. Okay, so it's the next morning. They found the private section of the beach reserved for guests of the Splendido Hotel, angled their chairs toward the sun, and lay side by side in a perfect row, surrounded on all sides by perfect rows, a grid of bodies presenting themselves for the delectation of the gods. The first time Frank encountered an Italian beach, he was shocked by its military precision. The sections organized by color and pattern, the cabanas numbered to correspond with the umbrellas, the young men who came through twice a day to rake the sand. In Jersey, you brought an old bedsheet and a cooler and 6 cousins and set up shop on the first free spot. Your knees rubbed against the hairy back of the guy next to you, and nobody squawked about it. There was pleasure in the Italian order. You knew your place and your color and your pattern. Nobody stole your watch. But he missed the messy collage of Monmouth and Asbury Park, where you tripped over radios and inflatable balls and the pots and pans people brought from their kitchens to make sandcastles. Anyone for a swim? He shouted down the silent row. Frank wasn't the type to lie around. If 10 were here, he'd at least be telling a story. 10 is back in the hotel room writing while they're on the beach. I'll go in, Anya said, languidly, but not for a while. I'm still cooking. She and her mother wore tight-fitting one-piece swimsuits that barely covered their thighs and which tied behind their necks in a little bow. Matching white bands framed their faces and exposed their foreheads to the rays. Did they own any clothes that weren't the brightest white? And did they only buy them in pairs? They were a blank canvas, inviting you to paint them, and yet they were also forbiddingly pristine. You wanted to drown these women in colored ink, and you wanted to shield them from the slightest smudge. Their skin was smooth and unbroken by moles or blemishes or hair, their legs and arms shellacked with oil that smelled of rosemary. They wore no makeup, no adornments or jewels. What had looked last night like flecks of gray in Anya's eyes were now in the bright sun and at the edge of the brilliant bay a chalky white, like little chips in a blue plate. He wanted to tell her that the white was like the crashing surf and her eyes like the water, but that was more of his bad poetry, and besides, 10 accused him of flirting too much with women. He did it more out of habit and manners and genuine appreciation than desire. In general, Frank wanted people to feel good about themselves. When they did, they made better company, and he had more fun. And wasn't having fun the point of everything? Sitting around on a beach chair was no fun at all. He looked around for someone to talk to, but the only person he recognized was Luca, the boat guy turned luggage guy turned driver guy, who stood with his fellow ragazzi over by his truck. Frank gave him a little wave. Should he approach him, propose a game of soccer? Luca lifted his chin at him as if to say, "What do you need now?" But by which he surely meant, "What do you need now, pervert?" It was always a walk across fire with these men, for even the most innocent of purposes, and it was even riskier without 10. A pack of younger boys were gathered behind Luca and his friends. They offered scooter rides to the tourists and rented them bikes by the hour. In a few years, they'd graduate to driving the tourists around in little vans. Frank wondered what, if anything, Luca would graduate into, or whether he'd just stay here, driving starlets and rich queens around for the rest of his life. To Anya, he said, "I must inform you that you're turning pink. Come cool off with me." "The skin burns faster in the water, no?" she asked. "That's a myth," Frank said. "Salt water actually protects the skin. It coats it in a kind of film. Look at me." He took a step back so she could admire his bronzed body. "I spend hours a day ocean swimming," he said, "and I never get sunburned." She eyed him skeptically. "Trust me," he said, "I lie only to men." In the bay, they floated beside each other for a long time. She cupped handfuls of the salty water, splashed it onto her face, and then rubbed it in like cold cream. "Next you will tell me that Paraji, that's the name of the beach, is the fountain of youth," she said. She ticked her head toward the chairs. "When I'm her age, I'll return here looking the same." First, though, Anya said, she had to find her mother a husband. Only after she was settled could Anya breathe and choose her city and make her own way in the world. It was something, she said. bringing up a mother. It took patience and a hard heart. You had to give her the illusion of control and maintain a clinical distance from the decisions you made for her, decisions she believed to be her own, but for which she took no responsibility. Only then would she release you. She had every intention of outliving you, of living forever, in fact, which gave you plenty of time to muck around in New York or Paris or wherever your dreams took you, as long as those dreams were so big they had no chance of coming true. One day, far into the future, broken but not destroyed, you could return to her, and she could mother you again, except that it would be the first time. Anya hated modeling, she told Frank. If she did aspire to act, as Bitta claimed, it was only to give her brain and her limbs something to do while the cameras were on her. Becoming an actress was more Bitta's dream for Anya than her own dream for herself. And as such, it would propel her out of her mother's orbit. She was 22. By her own admission, she knew everything and nothing. She would never marry, she said, not unless the man allowed her to be a glutton, not just on art and ideas, but on other men too. He would have to be very strong for that, and from what Anya had already seen, strong men with an appreciation for art and ideas seemed to prefer the company of other men and not of women, especially women who required that particular form of strength. This wasn't the conversation Frank hoped for or expected from this girl. He tried to interrupt with stories of his own mother and sisters, their small, aproned lives he looked upon with pity and a kind of envy. So sure they were of their place and their house, their square block of Jersey, the world. At Anya's age, he'd fled from their sights each morning in his uncle's truck to make his deliveries. In the afternoons, he'd pick up his buddies and park at the beach for hours, smoking and whistling from the front seat of the truck at the girls stepping down from the boardwalk. Then he'd fled from them too, those flightless boys, first for the war, and then, when the war spit him back onto shore, for the city. It was the city, he told Anya, where his eyes finally adjusted, where he could see men as if for the first time, leading him into unmarked doorways and the bright life behind them. She had no one to confide in, she said, no one to wrestle with, to discover, to tease back. For all her mother's ambitions, she kept her away from friends they made on their travels. She believed young women should remain mysterious, an unwritten story, whereas older women needed to perfect the art of storytelling in order to remain visible, to survive. What I find from men of your type, Anya said, is that you always want women to perform for you. We did this for Truman in the weeks after we came here. All over France we did this, Vienna too. What we wondered to each other, though, my dear mother and me, walking all the way up to this beach, walking all the way to this beach, up the hill, and then down from Portofino because no one offered to drive us, is what happens at the end of the performance. You walked here? Frank asked. Why didn't you ask Luca? Sorry. We wondered if we'll have a place to go after the curtain falls, she said, if we'll be safe there, if we'll have enough to eat. We wonder if we'll still interest you. Is there a place to dance in Portofino? Frank asked, hopefully. She said there was a small club, but that it was too loud to hear yourself think. Why do you need to think if you're dancing? He asked her. When they saw 10 step from the truck, it must have been 4 o'clock by then, they waved to him and pointed to the Splendido section. I have to go in, Frank said. Will you stay? No, she said, but she made no move toward the shore. He didn't know if it was just how the light was hitting her, but from this angle he could see through the fabric of her white swimsuit. He offered to race her, intending to lose by a length. She shook her head. Are you really leaving us this week? She asked. He reminded her of the trip to Verona for the Senso script. Visconti, the director, was insisting on the poetry of the dialogue, and Ten needed to hole himself up in a hotel to write it. They were meeting Paul Bowles and his new lover Ahmed, who were on their way up from Rome. That's him, she said. What about you? Do you go everywhere together? Not always. Do you have a new lover waiting for you in Verona? Not in Verona, Frank said. Then there's a chance our show will go on here, she said. I suppose there is, he said. Her mother was gone now, of course. Anya's most recent letter came posted from Madrid, where she'd been filming. She couldn't get to New York until the fall, she wrote, but surely Frank would be out of the hospital long before then. The cobalt treatments would do the trick this time. She'd enclosed a Polaroid from a recent shoot in Marrakesh, her head wrapped in one of those Muslim scarves, looking bored and triumphant astride a camel. She insisted on seeing him in Spain for the holidays. She loved Madrid so much that she purchased a floor-through apartment in a ramshackle building in La Latina, though she rarely spent more than a few nights in a row there. Sometimes Frank imagined this apartment, which he'd seen only in Anya's exuberant descriptions, as his next home. The sloping stucco butter yellow walls, the tall windows dripping with flowers, the wrought iron balcony that overlooked the tight, oppressed streets of the Plaza de San Andres. He'd roam these streets into the evenings on his way to late-night resistance meetings. He'd provide aid to the artists. He'd run money or arms, whatever the movement found necessary. In this next life, he is put to some good use. He set the photo on the little table next to the vases of flowers. With the last of the day's strength, he turned a page of the letter over and scribbled, "Come now, please, I need you." One word per line, like a madman's ransom note. He tucked the page back in the envelope, sealed it with a little spit and what was left of the glue, wrote "Return to sender" on the front, and handed it to the nurse. For the rest of the day, 1,000 hollow hours, he slept. He had no trouble nodding off, though he woke often and couldn't dream. The men in his ward, their sudden shouts and strangled gurgles, kept him in that shallow pool of sleep. He didn't mind the men. Their bodies and voices and breath kept him company, as they had in his Navy days. You couldn't convince him he wasn't back with his squadron, that they weren't sailing out first thing. "Quit clowning, Merlot," one of them said. "Nicky, Seahawk, get some shut-eye. We need your legs." When the night nurse woke him, she told him that he'd had a few visitors, Al and Dan, his sister Connie, the priest. There was always a priest. To the priest, Frank was carrion. He'd be back. The others, too, Vivian Lee, who'd thrown a party in his honor weeks before. Irene Selznick had dropped off an expensive tin of sweets. Someone else had called on the phone, the nurse said, but didn't leave a name or a message. "Man or woman?" Frank asked her. "Woman." "Woman," Frank repeated. What was it this time, he wondered? A crisis of staging, some diva actress pitching a fit? Was his precious Angel reading from a book of poems? Angel was Williams's new boyfriend. No, Ten had sent Angel back to Key West. This time it was the premiere of Milk Train, down in Virginia. Frank pulled the sheets up to his chin and turned on his side, wincing at the pressure of his ribs on the mattress. The nurse's shadow disappeared from the wall. He pushed the button to get her back. He needed a blanket. He needed 2 blankets and the oxygen. Every shiver turned the vice tighter on his chest's tender bones. He could feel the necrosis on his lips, blue as ice, his skin cracking. He pushed the button again. This place couldn't hold him. He would get to Spain. Anya would come and smuggle him out. Ten used to tease Frank about his daydreams, his giddy contemplations, how he always jumped ahead to the happy ending, a different way of ending happy each time. Even that night in Portofino, in the nameless bar, drunk to high heaven, Ten had proclaimed to their new friends with pride, "There are roses tattooed in my Frankie's eyes." And he was right. Never for one moment did Frank fear what Ten feared, what most men feared, which was that he'd die alone. It was funny how it had all turned out, wasn't it, Ten? Wasn't it almost funny? I'll stop there. Sorry to start you on the beach and then end in this like sad way. So I'm happy to take any questions, anything at all about this, about the writing of the book, about. Yes. Yes.
In the movie, I was always fascinated. Katharine Hepburn was extremely beautiful, and obviously Elizabeth Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
My point is, what was this is over 7 years ago, what was the come like? In other words, they bring these women, the majority of men say are gay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not getting why he bothers to bring this beautiful woman that they're not going to do anything with.
Right. Yeah. As you say, they're decoys, right? So
Yeah.
it's a way for him to pass, essentially, right? It was 2 things.
Okay.
It's a way for him to pass. He's seen with a beautiful young woman, so he can pass as this is my wife, or this is my girlfriend, or this is my whatever. And then in the meantime, he's kind of liaisoning with men, and they also have their own kind of like cover because he's straight, it's the woman. But it's also not just that; it's that if he brings his old mother, who's clearly not anyone who could be attracted, he could be attracted to legitimately, then it doesn't work, right? And also, if she's too old, if she's not young and beautiful like Elizabeth Taylor, she's not going to attract any attention either. Like they're not even going to notice her. So it's all about this kind of. It's such a weird play. It's all about these kind of exchanges that men and women have, and about people in general, like what ways we sort of exploit each other. And what she's getting out of it is a free trip to, a great trip to, in the play it's Spain, but in the book it's Italy. In my book it's Italy, but but it is it's a twisted dynamic.
But the young kids are so crazy.
Yeah.
Like the kids, and I've seen the movie a couple times.
Yeah.
They're angry that he's not giving them money.
Right.
And then they start to follow him and attack him. It's almost
Exactly.
like he knows this is gonna happen.
Right.
He's
Yeah.
egging them on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it becomes a little bit of a death wish, right? That's kind of what Williams was sort of alluding to potentially. It's about the sort of self-hatred and punishment. Some people have called it they call it like a homophobic play, in fact, like, or at least in sort of a document of his self-hatred or internalized homophobia. I don't really read it that way, but I do think it's about a little bit about his shame, I guess you could say. His shame sort of comes through a little bit for sure. So, yeah.
What kind of research were you doing when you went to Italy? What kind of things were you looking for besides getting a feel?
Yes, exactly. Well, I lay on the
Getting a
beach
sense.
for a while just to see how it felt.
Yeah.
I only spent a day in Portofino because even though so much of the book is set there, I went around and I walked up and down the streets just taking pictures of everything, getting a sense. It's very touristy now, and you have to have a ton of money to really enter into like the real Portofino, And I wanted to stay at the Splendido, but it was $650 a night, and I was like, I can't swing that. So I really just document how it felt to be there. But I did so much, like for the longest time, John Horn Burns, who I told you about earlier, who was drinking himself to death in Florence, he was going to be a much bigger part of the story. And so a lot of the research I did in Italy was, what he would do is he would get up every morning. He lived in a hill town just outside of Florence, and he would get up every morning and he would take the bus into Florence, and he would park himself at the bar at the Excelsior Hotel, and he would write, quote unquote, meaning he would drink all day long, and then he would get more and more belligerent and more kind of miserable and awful, and then he would take the last bus back to Settignano, which is the name of the town. And again, he was going to be more of a character, so I'm like, I'm going to follow in his footsteps. So I went to the Excelsior Hotel, and I didn't stay all day. I just went and had a drink, and I sat at the bar where he would sit, and then I took the bus up to Settignano, and I tried to find the house where he lived because I wanted to see where he lived, and that's a whole story that we don't have time for. But if we run out of questions, I'll tell you that. And I spent, so much time writing so many notes, so many pictures, didn't use one scrap of it, because that nothing, we never end up going to Florence in the book. So it was that kind of thing. It was like just experiential, just being there and just getting the feel of it and documenting a lot. And then you know what it's like when you're stuck, you just like go to a photo and say, let me just kind of just describe that scene and work it in somewhere, and then it'll like spark something. Yeah. Yes.
So you say that Tennessee Williams was always writing journals,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Was there anything written left behind by Frank?
Yes, letters.
Oh, there were.
Yeah, so there were letters that they wrote to each other, which I was able to read, which are amazing. But strangely not as like useful as I hoped they would be. They were pretty almost informational. Like I did this and I did that and I did that, but it wasn't like why don't you love me or whatever. It wasn't like that, unfortunately. But in a way, it just helped me to get it. He was extremely well read. He was, William said he read more books than he did, and he was very into classical music, opera, He was very much an aesthete. Frank was. He wasn't just a like Goomba truck driver from Jersey. He was very much a sort of, but he came from that kind of milieu, and so people kind of didn't take him seriously because of where he came from. But he was quite well read and quite articulate, and people actually, Williams was a mercurial character, as I mentioned, mercurial person, but everybody had their kind of love-hate thing with him. But Frank, everybody loved. Like, he was just universally just kind of adored, People were suspicious of him, of course. Like, some people they thought he's a gold digger or whatever, but he stayed around so long that he kind of earned their trust. And he earned Williams's trust, which was another important thing. Like, Williams was always convinced that the guys that he would hire, because actually Frank was his secretary, was officially his assistant, which is also how they got around. And so Williams was always convinced that his assistants were stealing from him, but he never questioned Frank's loyalty to him. So, yeah.
What was your impetus to go back to the leading men? What were you attracted to the men of that era? Or was it the story?
Yeah, I mean, the title came. I mean, I always had. It was always the working title from the beginning. I didn't even fully know what it meant in a way, but I knew that for me it meant the original intent was that Williams had Williams had many partners, and he had 2 significant relationships before Frank, and he had a few after Frank. But in my opinion, so he had all these men who were playing the role of his partner. But in my reading, like interpretation, and in actually most people's interpretation, Frank was the leading man of all of those men. Other ones were supporting roles, and he was playing the leading part. So that was one meaning. And then with the other character, with Anya, she has 4 men in her life who kind of form her life. And so she has these 4 significant leading men in her life. And so her character explores her relationship with them, and Frank, being one of them, and as a friend. But they have a little bit of frisson as well, like, because Frank was, had dated women and so they had a little bit of a frisson as well. So it was that. And I also wanted, of course, to conjure up, films, stage with the like idea of leading men, or leading ladies. So yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I really
I have
appreciate it.
one
Oh, yeah, sure.
question.
Yeah.
I didn't forget the answer. Your other books, are they straight novels, or are they also kind of this imagined?
There, for like when I was working on this, I kept thinking, God, this is a real departure, because I've never written about real people or whatever. But then I sort of was like, wait, my first 3 novels were actually very, very much inspired by my family, my parents, my mother in particular, my siblings. So really, I kind of need to steal characters from somewhere. So in order to, and I feel like that's what fiction is for in a way. Like you get these characters, whether they're people you're based on or people who really lived, and what fiction does is they give them an inner life, and you get to kind of walk in their shoes, think what they think, and it brings them alive in a way more than biography could or anything else. So in a way this was a departure, but in a way it actually felt quite normal. Yeah.
Are you working on another novel?
Not at the moment, but I'm sort of doing some research on the sly, not about about a real situation, but not real people, like not the people who are in this situation. It's about a series of disappearances. The people who are disappeared, I wouldn't be like writing their stories, but I want to somehow use these disappearances in some way. That's about as far as I've gotten. I've done a lot of research on the disappearances, but I don't know how I'm going to use it. So I have like a situation, but not a story. Yeah. So yeah. So.
But you think you're done with these characters?
I think I'm done with these characters. Yeah. I mean, one thing that was important to me with this, not important to me, but just the way it just played out was it's not a biopic of Williams or of Frank. Like I don't start when Frank is young and have them in high school and all that kind of stuff. Like it's like the span of time that takes place in Italy is like a couple weeks, and then there's a couple days in the hospital when he's looking back, and then so it's this compressed. Like the idea is that those couple weeks kind of stand for their relationship and tell the story of their relationship in microcosm, right? So, and then Anya's sections start in the present and then cover a bunch of years, and nothing from her past is in it. Like there's no scenes of her films, there's no scenes of her, and so there's all this material that isn't in the book, but I have no interest in writing that. It just has to kind of be there. And because I wanted to write her character as someone who was only looking forward, who was never looking back. It was very important to me to have no flashbacks in the book. So they're actually, like, even though Frank is looking back, the whole thing is a flashback, her character never, there's no backstory, there's nothing. He's always looking forward. So anyway, so my point is, there's all this material that isn't in the book that I probably could write, but I'm not interested. Yeah.
I was thinking of the character that, you followed in his footsteps and then, wait a minute, it's just a drama.
Right. Exactly.
Excuse me, so Frank then was his partner for about 10 years
15 years.
But before this situation?
They were before what? Before they go to Portofino. They were there. They were together for about 4 years. And then they were in Portofino, and then they were together until they were like officially together until like 1960, and then they were estranged. But Williams they were still living blocks from each other. Williams bought him a house, bought him a TV, bought him all these things, and then Williams but let him live in his apartment while he was undergoing treatments for cancer. They were always seeing each other. They were very tense. They had other relationships, but they were and Williams had gifted him a pretty fat percentage of the rose tattoo. So he knew that he was set up for life. And so he took care of him, just like Frank had taken care of Williams their whole life, emotionally. Frank was the one who talked Williams down from the ledge from when he was having a bad day, which is always, and when he was hypochondriacal and neurotic and all of that, so, which is very useful if you're a writer. You need someone to do that for you, for sure. So, yeah. So. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you.
Identity theft happens. It's an unfortunate fact of modern life. But there are certain steps you can take to help keep your personal information from falling into the wrong hands. Every day you do things to protect what's most important to you. And you know what? You do them almost automatically. Routine things like looking both ways before you cross, brushing your teeth, and buckling your seatbelt. Another routine to get into is keeping tabs on your identity and personal information. Here are 5 easy ways you can do it. Read your credit card and bank statements carefully and often. Know your payment due dates. If a bill doesn't show up when you expect it, look into it. Read the statements from your health insurance plan. Make sure the claims paid match the care you got. Shred any documents with personal and financial information. Review each of your 3 credit reports at least once a year. It's easy and it's free. And before you know it, protecting your personal information can be as routine as locking your doors at night. For more tips and tools on dealing with identity theft, visit ftc.gov/ID theft. That's ftc.gov/ID theft.
If you have a telephone, it probably seems like illegal robocalls are out of control. I'm Katie Daffin, an attorney at the Federal Trade Commission. If you pick up the phone and hear a recorded message instead of a live person, that's a robocall. Consumers are getting more and more robocalls, and they are not happy about it. As the number of calls has multiplied, the number of complaints has too. The reason for the spike in robocalls has to do with technology. Companies are using auto dialers that can send out thousands of phone calls every minute for an incredibly low cost. What's important is that the companies that use this technology don't bother to screen for the numbers on the National Do Not Call Registry. If a company doesn't care about obeying the law, you can be sure they're trying to scam you. You've probably gotten robocalls about candidates running for office or charities asking for donations. These robocalls are allowed. But any robocall that's trying to sell you something probably is illegal, unless you've given your written permission to get calls from that company. The FTC has stopped billions, yes, billions of robocalls in the last 2 years. Tracing these calls is a tough job, and there are a few reasons for that. One is that many different companies use the same or very similar recorded messages. Another is that they fake the caller ID information that you see on your phone. That's called caller ID spoofing, and new technology makes it very easy to do. And a third is that the robocallers often place the calls through internet technology that hides their location. At the FTC, we're continuing our aggressive enforcement efforts, and we're also looking for innovative technological solutions to the robocall problem. For more information, please visit ftc.gov/robocalls. That's ftc.gov/robocalls.
Shopping for a car? Applying for a job? Looking for a home? Or just getting your financial house in order? Then it's time to check your credit report. Good news, it's free. The law entitles you to one free copy of your credit report from each of the 3 nationwide credit reporting companies every 12 months. Why is it important to check your credit report? It has important information about your financial accounts, how you pay your bills, and if you file for bankruptcy. You want to make sure everything is accurate, especially before you buy a house or a car, or apply for a job. If you notice something wrong, contact the credit reporting company and business providing the information to correct the error. And checking your report can help you guard against identity theft. Visit ftc.gov/ID theft if you spot accounts that aren't yours. How do you order your free credit report? Order online from annualcreditreport.com, the only authorized website for free credit reports, or call 1-877-322-8228. You'll need to provide your name, address, social security number, and date of birth to verify your identity. Keep in mind, you're entitled to one free copy of your credit report every 12 months from each of the 3 nationwide credit reporting companies. So the next time someone asks, "How's your credit?" you'll have the answer. To order your free credit report, visit annualcreditreport.com or call 1-877-322-8228.
If you have a telephone, robocalls may be ruining your day. I'm Katie Daffin, an attorney at the Federal Trade Commission. If you answer the phone and hear a recorded message instead of a live person, it's a robocall. If the recording is a sales message and you haven't given your written permission to get calls from the company on the other end, the call is illegal, period. So, when you get an illegal robocall, here's what to do. Hang up the phone. Don't press 1 to speak to a live operator, and don't press any other number to get off the list. If you respond by pressing any number, it will probably just lead to more robocalls. You might consider contacting your phone provider and asking them to block the number and whether they charge for that service. Remember that telemarketers change caller ID information easily and often, so it might not be worth paying a fee to block a number that will change. Finally, contact the FTC to report your experience. You can do that online at ftc.gov or by calling 1-877-FTC-HELP. To learn more about illegal robocalls and what the FTC is doing to stop them, visit ftc.gov/robocalls. That's ftc.gov/robocalls.